e convidamos para a primeira palestra do painel 2 o professor Dr. Frank Wolak. O Dr. Frank Wolak é professor titular de Economia na Universidade de Stanford, especialista no estudo de concorrência e regulamentação em indústrias de rede, tem vasta experiência na supervisão regulatória de mercados de eletricidade, tendo atuado em um grande número de países. Ele formou-se na Universidade de Rice e obteve o título de mestre em matemática aplicada e de doutor em economia pela Universidade de Harvard. Conforme disse o Richard há pouco, no final da palestra nós teremos um espaço para perguntas e respostas, enfim. Desde já, nossas recepcionistas estão à disposição para receber as fichas com as perguntas anotadas. Essas fichas encontram-se dentro dessas pastas que os senhores receberam lá na recepção ou nas mãos também das nossas recepcionistas. Basta levantar a mão que uma delas chega até você. E agora vamos receber o professor Dr. Frank Wolak.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today about international experience with wholesale electricity market design. And what I'd like to talk about is essentially sort of two broad areas. First is the short-term market design. And essentially, I guess what I would say here is that in the United States, we've evolved considerably since the start of restructuring in the late 1990s, and there's been an increasing amount of standardization. I'd like to think that's because of the fact that we've learned what works and what doesn't work. You can draw whatever conclusion you'd like, but that's mine. The other is that what they've settled on is what's called a bid-based multi-settlement locational marginal pricing market. And there's varying degrees of retail competition. This just gives you a map of all the places in the United States. So in every one of the areas that you see that are shaded different from white, that's what exists there. And so what I thought I'd like to do is essentially talk about from the perspective of Brazil, hopefully learning from what has worked in the United States in terms of multi-settlement, locational marginal pricing, bid-based market, and essentially expanding the scope of retail competition. The other thing that I'd like to talk about is this long-term resource adequacy. And here, bring in more of the experience internationally, talking about sort of what called capacity energy market combination versus energy only. Both of these, there seems to be still in the United States divergence here. There are regions that use the capacity energy paradigm. I've listed them. There are also ones that use, I think, the energy-only paradigm. And internationally, that's also the case. I'd say outside of Latin America, the capacity energy paradigm is not used as frequently. It's primarily an energy market paradigm. So I discuss sort of the relative merits of both and what I think the lessons are for Brazil from this experience. So first topic is the multi-settlement market. So the first lesson just from electricity market design in general is this is a just-in-time market, and so planning ahead really can provide a more efficient use of the resources that you have, and in particular, for systems that have a diverse set of resources, in particular, the thermal units as well as hydro units and the like, and trying to essentially get an efficient dispatch of those units from running a market an hour at a time can be very difficult. In other words, I, as a, say, nuclear provider or as a coal-fired power plant, I may have a pattern of output that I'd like to get. Having to sell each hour independently to achieve that could be a bit challenging. And so what's happened is that in the United States is we've transitioned to this day-ahead forward market where what's happened is I have a two-part bid, essentially a bid for my startup and no-load cost as well as for my energy offer curve. And then what happens is that the ISO effectively solves a a dispatch problem for all 24 hours of the following day simultaneously to essentially minimize the as-bid cost necessary to meet demand at all locations in the market. This results in what are called day-ahead schedules for generation units as well as load, and these schedules are essentially firm financial commitments. And what do I mean by firm financial commitments? Well, I mean that essentially you get paid for what you sold in the day-ahead market regardless of what you do, even though that thing is just purely a financial commitment. So in other words, if I sell 40 megawatts in the day-ahead market for $25, that's essentially $1,000 that I get. And, now the question is if I only produce, as I say in my example here, 30 megawatt hours, then I'm on the hook to purchase out of the real-time market what I did not supply from my unit in real time. And the same logic applies if I'm a load-serving entity. I pay for what I purchased in the day-ahead market, and if I don't essentially purchase that, or if I purchase more, as my example, both examples go through, then I have to buy or sell that residual in the real-time market. All right. So what this does is essentially it really, I think, supports the reliability of supply, and in particular, it compensates units for the reliability that they do provide. So the example I give is just suppose that I have intermittent resources on the system and dispatchable resources. One of the big challenges, how do I value those dispatchable resources for the services that they provide versus the intermittent resources? Well, in a multi-settlement market, it just sort of naturally does that, even though it's paying both resources the same price in both markets. So take the example as I gave where the wind unit, that essentially it schedules more than in the day-ahead market, and essentially it produces less in real time, and therefore must essentially purchase out of the real-time market what it failed to provide in real time. And the example that I show you is that the dispatchable unit, because it is able to dispatch up when the wind units don't show up, it gets a higher average price than does the intermittent wind unit, even though in both of the markets the units are effectively selling for the same price. Okay, so as we say that this is in some sense the multi-settlement market is rewarding the dispatchability of the thermal unit. We can take the opposite example of saying, okay, the wind units produce more than they were scheduled to produce, so the thermal unit can back down, and as a result of the thermal unit backing down during a time in which the wind units produce a whole lot more, again, the thermal unit is rewarded for its dispatchability by a higher average price than is the wind units. Okay, and so in that sense, one of the big advantages of the multi-settlement market is it rewards this dispatchability of the wind units, even though what it's doing in both markets is paying the same price for the energy that is sold from both units. The fact is that energy is, of course, energy, and so in that sense, it should be setting price the same for both. The other is that that's very helpful about the multi-settlement market is it makes demand-side participation very easy. And in particular, it gives the demand-side provider the ability to sell back demand that it does not actually consume. So I give the example of essentially buying a certain amount in the day-ahead market and then effectively not consuming it in real time, which is the equivalent of actually selling that power back in the real-time market and rewarding the the provider for essentially reducing its demand. And a big challenge that we've had in the US markets is, and in other markets around the world, is essentially demand response providers selling something that they didn't actually own. In other words, selling demand reductions relative to some administrative baseline. This creates reliability challenges. This creates all sorts of problems. A multi-settlement market, all you simply have is the load serving entity, the retailer, whatever. It schedules in the day-ahead market, say 100. It only consumes 90. It is effectively selling back that 10 megawatts at the day ahead, at the real-time price. To the extent that system conditions are stressed in real time, that retailer can save a considerable amount of money by essentially avoiding purchasing during the very high price period. And as I write right here, is it really is the key to developing a demand-side participation is this multi-settlement market, as well as getting the benefits from interval meters, dynamic pricing, and retail competition. All right, the next topic I want to talk about is locational marginal pricing. And one lesson I think that we've learned from all markets around the world is that what you need is the market model that sets prices, determines dispatch, needs to be as close as possible to the physical reality that exists in the grid. If it doesn't, then market participants can certainly take actions to effectively profit from the fact that that they know eventually the physical realities of the grid are going to dominate. And I give a bunch of examples here, the so-called negative reconciliation payments that are necessary in the Colombian market to essentially account for the fact that the single zone that they set price for the entire country is not exactly right because of the finiteness of the transmission network or because of the availability of other operating constraints. In the case of Australia, there is a constrained on and constrained off generation within a given zone. The Australian market runs basically on effectively zones being the states of the country. The other is in all the US markets that started out as zonal markets, we would have essentially what's called intra-zonal congestion, and this actually led to participants exploiting that fact, and it was even titled the so-called debt game for effectively generation units getting paid to effectively cut back because they knew that something that they may have scheduled in the zonal market would not actually be able to run in real time. Well, the advantage of the LMP market is that it's not going to essentially, limits as much as possible the difference between the market model and essentially the pricing and actual operation of the transmission network. So what this means is that you're not going to get these infeasible schedules in the day-ahead market. You are going to get a schedule from generation units that is very likely to be able to run in real time. Essentially, I won't skip over discussion of the LMPs, but basically, the big issue with an LMP market as well is that it is going to allow you to run a formal wholesale market on virtually any transmission network that exists. The United States started restructuring with, as one of our Secretary of Energies like to say, a 19th century transmission grid. There are reasons in the question and answer we can get into why that was the case, but basically what that meant was we had lots of intrazonal congestion, we had lots of local market power issues in the market before the transition to LMP. The Europeans sort of took a different approach, but the reason they could take a different approach is because of the fact that most of the European markets started from the state-owned company, which had, if anything, probably an overbuilt transmission network, so there was very little opportunities for congestion within the zone, i.e. going back to the initial point that I made, the agreement between the market model, i.e. the single zone for the country, and the actual configuration of the grid was very good because simply they had built a lot of transmission capacity in the former vertically integrated state-owned monopoly regime. But as I said, the successful zonal design requires that, and essentially the big failure of the U.S. zonal market designs was the fact that effectively that did not exist. So for example, in California, as well as in ERCOT, the Texas market, and New England, which were all zonal markets to start, there wasn't this commitment that, look, we will build sufficient transmission so that within each zone, the frequency of intrazonal congestion will be very low, and so therefore, the agreement between the market model and the configuration of the grid will be very close. All right. So the other is as I said, is that an LMP, the advantage is it can be used to operate virtually any transmission network that you'd like, and essentially the only thing that you're going to certainly need is some essentially local market power mitigation mechanisms, but as I said, you don't need what you need with the zonal market, which is this commitment to essentially build sufficient transmission to make everything equally effective, all units in the zone equally effective at meeting load in that zone. And this has an very interesting implication, which essentially says that what is the optimal configuration of the transmission network depends very much on the pricing mechanism that you use. If you're going to go to a zonal market design, you're going to need to make much more transmission investments. If you're going to go with a nodal market design, you're going to need less transmission investments, perhaps, in order to have an effective market with a nodal market design. Okay, so these are just some examples of where the LMP market, I think, can effectively increase system reliability and market efficiency, in that the first and foremost is the fact that you won't get a day-ahead schedule that deviates very significantly from what actually can operate in real time. And so this will make the market participants focus on just how do I make money selling energy in real time, not how will I make money exploiting the difference between the configuration of the grid and the market model that you use. The other is LMPs essentially will provide very strong signals for local scarcity. That, in other words, if there's a local scarcity in the grid, the price can get extremely high to reflect that fact. And in particular, you can get prices from LMP markets that are above the highest offer price at that location. And you can get prices in LMP markets that are below the lowest offer price at that location. And those are really what are providing strong signals for loads to come to those locations, or loads to increase consumption at those low price locations and reduce their consumption at those high price locations. All right. So just to give you a real world example of the benefits of LMP, California switched to an LMP market on April 1, 2009. And what we did is looked at essentially what happens as a result of that. So they switched from a multi-settlement bid-based LMP market from the zonal market design that previously exists. What we did is we looked at, essentially using data from the ISO, we looked at how much heat energy was used to produce the thermal energy that was actually supplied to the grid. And we also looked at the cost associated with that. And to get that cost, we took the heat energy multiplied by the price of natural gas that we knew from the market. We knew of startup costs and what the costs of starting the units are. It's all described in the paper that I've cited right there. And what we found was that controlling for the total amount of thermal output that was produced in an hour in the ISO, California ISO system, we found that essentially the transition from zonal to LMP resulted in a savings of about 2% each hour in terms of the total heat energy used, as well as in the total cost, variable cost associated with dispatching the system. That's just simply achieving, if you like, a more efficient configuration of the thermal units throughout the 24 hours of the day to effectively meet what was the residual left over after, say, the intermittent resources were being used and other resources were being used. And so essentially, we both savings in terms of cost as well as heat energy used. So the joke I like to say is that not only is LMP cost effective, but it is green because it reduced the amount of thermal energy necessary to produce the same amount of aggregate output from the thermal units. So could Brazil do this? My answer is yes. I think they'd be rather straightforward. Their software exists. Essentially, what would happen is generation units would submit locational bids for the 24 hours of the following day, startup, no load cost. Retailers would submit bids into the day-ahead market. You could run essentially the day-ahead market, get hourly schedules for each of the units, get hourly prices, and then have a real-time imbalanced market. California has quite a bit of hydro capacity, certainly not as much as Brazil does, but if you, but still a significant amount, and even more so if you include what is in the Pacific Northwest. So essentially, what we could have is essentially hourly prices that would signal differences in the cost to serve. This is becoming more and more relevant as the need for hourly prices as the share of thermal units on the system in Brazil increases. The other is you could have locational prices to reflect both transmission constraints and, even more important, just relevant operating constraints. And in particular, one such operating constraint could be the constraints on the hydro river systems. So in other words, we have constraints on how the units that can operate across those river systems. You can build that exactly into the LMP dispatch process. And so, as we said, what we could get is certainly day-ahead forward market to allow more efficient dispatch of the long start units. Essentially, the other thing that you could do with this LMP market is you can integrate the system operation with the market operation, largely because the LMP process is exactly what is being used to dispatch the system. So you only need a combined system market operator. You don't need two separate ones. So essentially, bid-based market. What's the advantage of a bid-based market? Well, the difference is just simply that the market price is now going to be the highest offer that someone submits, not the highest variable cost. There's now would no longer need to be this mathematical program that gets solved to determine the opportunity cost of water. That would be the result of, in fact, the bids and offers of all the market participants in Brazil. And the other thing that I should say is that this sort of transition from cost-based market to bid-based market has actually occurred in the United States. In particular, PJM market was, during its first year, operated as a cost-based market. As people got more familiar with how the market would work, it then transitioned to a bid-based market. One of the advantages, as I said, of a bid-based market is that you're in many ways, sort of removing a lot of the political economy aspect. You're allowing the market participants, through their willingness to supply, to determine what prices are, rather than essentially perhaps the administrative process determining what the market price is. But one of the big things that's important, and I just want to emphasize, is that bid-based markets, yes, there are, and I as a Californian know very well, without a proper design, a bid-based market can result in the exercise of substantial unilateral market power. But one of the things we've certainly learned in the United States is there are effective mechanisms to address this. And these are basically fixed price forward contract coverage of final demand by retail consumers. Check, Brazil has that. The other is bid caps on the short-term market. The other is that essentially potentially a price cap. And finally, local market power mitigation mechanisms. So with those four things in place, and in particular, the biggest one is what Brazil already has, which is a very high level of fixed price forward contract coverage of final demand. A bid-based market really doesn't have, I think, significantly more opportunities for suppliers to implement large wealth transfers, but has a lot of the benefits that I'd like to discuss. Which is, so, essentially, what can happen is that, as I said, this does is essentially decentralizes, if you like, the dispatch of generation units with the potential prices reflecting, if you like, the aggregate willingness to pay or consensus willingness to pay or receive and sell water. Essentially what happens is you get this nice aggregation of information about hydrological conditions versus just simply the solution to a mathematical programming problem, say, based on historical conditions, which we certainly know is unlikely to be correct, and therefore has this, incentive to intervene to override what the mathematical program might provide. So one of the issues I think is very important to address is this idea that it's often claimed that the reason Brazil must have a cost-based dispatch is because of these river system hydro units that need to be essentially operated in a certain manner, and only a math program can do that. Well, as I said earlier, you can actually build in whatever operating constraints you'd like for the hydro system. The other is there's this, what we call in economics, the Coase theorem, which essentially says that if property rights are well defined, players can essentially negotiate to achieve the most efficient solution. So if what we have is 2 or 3 or 4 hydrological suppliers on the same river system, and if they're all forward contracted for most of their energy supply, they will figure out the way to bid in to essentially achieve what is jointly best for them in terms of dispatching the system. And so essentially this problem can be easily decentralized, easily solved, and in addition, if you're really worried, you can actually build the constraints in to the LMP pricing process and price them. So in other words, if, say, one hydro supplier wants to supply more water, he's going to receive a very low price because that constraint will be binding, and that constraint will effectively require that he gets a low price. He probably doesn't want that, so he will dispatch, hopefully in a more efficient manner. So essentially, as I said, decentralization, I think there is a long literature in economics. I would just cite a paper that we wrote in California where we essentially showed that allowing more participants in to the electricity market, in this case purely financial participants, has actually improved the dispatch of the system, largely because these financial participants, although they make profits exploiting differences between the day-ahead and real-time market, the fact when they are correct and they make money, they make the if you like, day-ahead schedules become closer to real-time system operation, which essentially reduces the volatility of real-time prices, reduces the volatility between day-ahead and real-time prices, reduces the amount that generators have to move relative to where their day-ahead schedules are, and thereby reduces the cost of dispatching the system again. All right. So, as I said, the last point just wanted to make is, look here, skipping a bit more. So, the big issue here, as we said, is that the current market is using this sort of stochastic dynamic program. The bid-based market essentially would eliminate the need to specify this stochastic dynamic program. And one of the big issues is there's this strong incentive to put the cost of deficit parameter very low. This is also not unique to Brazil. The cost of deficit parameter in Chile is also very low. This has the very politically beneficial outcome that it keeps the price of power very low, but it also has the very challenging outcome that it can increase the frequency and magnitude of shortages. And so, one of the big questions that you can eliminate if you have the bid-based market is the need for this, because now it is the willingness to supply of participants rather than this administratively set parameter that is determining whether or not the hydro units operate. All right. So, and this has the benefit that I think one of the things that we've seen in a number of the markets that are bid-based is they are very good at essentially managing the shortage conditions. They are, what they typically tend to do is reward those units that are there, able to supply power during those shortage conditions. And if all retailers are adequately contracted, the only difference is that the suppliers that are over-contracted relative to the energy they provide, they are subject to difference payments. The suppliers that are under-contracted and supplying the additional power, they are being paid, but consumers are protected by the fact that they have adequate fixed-price contracting for their retail load, and so you just move right through the low water conditions without a need for administrative intervention or without the need for essentially shortage periods curtailing demand. All right, so the other issue with respect to bid-based markets is this idea of participation of state-owned firms. And the nice thing there is that if there are state-owned firms in a bid-based market, they have to compete, they have to submit bids. This is going to exercise discipline on them in terms of how they operate it. And the other, as I said here, is that a bid-based dismax makes it much more difficult for government to intervene in the price-setting process, and in particular, adjusting the cost of shortage parameter. The other is the fact of using sort of reliability constraints that aren't potentially priced in order to essentially manage potential shortfalls. The example I give in Brazil is the so-called risk aversion curve. A curve is one such example. So, as I said, just the last bit is on this is that I'll leave it to the discussion, fuller discussion in the paper. So the next point is just retail competition, and here what I want to talk about is there is a very intimate, at least the way I like to think about it is there's three things that you want to think about in terms of expanding the scope of retail competition. First is technology, is that what you need is the ability to measure the demand with a high level of spatial granularity at the customer's premises. If you have just conventional meters, I think the argument for retail competition gets much less. Largely because what you have to do is you do what's called load profile billing, where you effectively use a standardized load shape to essentially allocate the customer's hourly demand or weekly demand to the various periods within the month. And this really doesn't provide much incentive for people to reduce their demand. And so as we said, is that if there are interval meters, we can essentially, it's hard to see why you can't essentially do what's called charge the customer, the customer's retailer, the actual cost to serve that customer in that hour. And that's, you avoid this problem that with load profile billing, as we saw right here, where if I'm using load profile billing, the customer only benefits to the same extent reducing his demand when the price is 0 as when the price is 1,000, because he's just billed on his total consumption in the month times the load profile weighted average price that he pays. Whereas if what we have is you're measuring the customer's consumption through the hourly meters, you're charging the retailer based on that customer's hourly consumption for the purchases from the wholesale market, then essentially there's very little reason that you can't have retail competition for those kinds of customers. So the basic conclusion is that anybody that has an hourly meter and you have this price pass-through, meaning that the retailer that serves them is obligated to pay the hourly real-time price for all of their consumption, then it makes no sense not to have retail competition for those customers. And the other is that, as I write here, is that pretty much you can't buy a mechanical meter. Most of the metering is electronic metering at this point. So essentially it makes as you transition to more and more interval meters, you can therefore then transition to more and more retail competition. In most of the markets in the world, metering is essentially operated as a regulated service, distribution company service, and essentially then competition takes place given that regulated metering service. And then the last point there is just to say, purchase the cheapest meter necessary to record hourly consumption. Remember, there's the internet. The internet can be used for all the back-end things. All you need is the ability to measure the hourly consumption. Everything else can be done through other means. All right, so the last point that I want to talk about is the question of long-term resource adequacy. And here, as I said, the two paradigms are the energy capacity and energy only. And the United States is somewhat unique in the sense that it pays a market clearing price for both energy and capacity. In other places, what it's the case is that it's a cost-based market with essentially a capacity payment mechanism. In the US, the argument that's been traditionally made is this so-called missing money problem, is that because we might have an offer cap on the short-term market, we are going to create missing money for the peaker units. Now, this argument, I think, has some problems, particularly if you recognize that, look, if we have interval meters, if we can have active demand-side participation in the short-term market, cost of service regulation. Each year, if you read the market monitoring reports in the areas that have the capacity market, you'll find that they very begrudgingly essentially acknowledge that this version of the capacity market is not working that great, that it's a sort of necessary Band-Aid that they have to have for long-term resource adequacy. They're very apologetic about it. In other words, there really is not what you would call a successful capacity market design, certainly in the United States. Now, and then the other issue is just the fact that it doesn't address what you could call as the primary resource adequacy problem, which is effectively sufficient energy to meet demand. Capacity shortfalls, even in the United States, are highly unlikely, and moreover, in a hydro-dominated system such as Brazil, they're very unlikely, being that it really is an energy shortfall that's the problem. And so what you need is fixed price forward contracts to insure against that risk. And the example that I give is the fact that, really, any of the rolling blackouts that occurred in California had nothing to do with having adequate generation capacity. It had to do with inadequate forward contracting for energy that committed suppliers to the short-term market. So the other thing about it is that as you scale up the share of renewable energy, the value of a capacity market becomes even less. The example in the United States I'd like to give is California. As we're scaling up to get 33% renewables, the amount of renewable capacity that's actually available to supply energy during peak demand periods is virtually zero. Particularly for the wind units. In particular, during the very hot day that there is no wind, you're not getting any energy from the wind capacity that exists there. True, you're probably getting more from the solar capacity, but there's also a degradation in solar PV production when the temperature is higher. So essentially, again, you're not addressing the primary reliability concern. So the simple idea is that the capacity versus energy-only paradigm, I guess the argument that I would make on that is that certainly from the United States, there has not been found a well-functioning capacity market. The energy-only markets appear to be working very well. The other idea of the fact is that, yes, they do require a very high level of fixed-price forward contract coverage of final demand. And okay, so what are the lessons for Brazil? Well, so let me just go through them quickly. So essentially, the first one would be instead of having a low cost of deficit parameter and a capacity market, why not just eliminate the capacity market, raise the cost of deficit parameter to a level that the expected revenues exactly compensate for the revenues to the generation sector that used to come from the capacity payment. This has the advantage, as we discuss in this paper, looking at the case of Chile, of essentially more conservative use of water, lower frequency of shortages, increased payments to a share of the payments going to the generation that actually provide reliability, the thermal generation, greater rewards for demand reduction because during high price periods, you're getting higher price periods for energy as a result of the higher cost of deficit, greater reward for both generators to be available and loads to go away. And the aggregate cost to consumers is exactly the same because what you've done is you've ensured that the generation sector is just receiving the same amount of revenue. So seems to me a good way. The other is the issue of separation from the old energy and new energy auctions, I think, is an example of what may be short-term beneficial, but may not be long-term least cost. And I just show you a diagram here of saying we have the supply of new energy, we have the supply of old energy, and what happens is that the demand for old energy essentially is, say, picked to reduce the total cost of old energy, and so the small box you can see there, plus the big box that you can see there, on the other side for new energy, is lower than if you took the sum of the two boxes where you treated the same two markets as integrated. But the important thing to notice is if you look at the area underneath the new energy curve and the area underneath the old energy curve, the sum of those two trapezoids is less than the sum of the two trapezoids when you're treating the two products as integrated, meaning that the area underneath the new energy curve and the area under the old energy curve, the sum of those things is less than the sum of those two areas. So essentially you are reducing the wholesale purchase cost of consumers, at least in the short term, but you're increasing the total cost that has to be recovered because you're not essentially balancing the marginal costs across the two markets as you would if you had an integrated market. So the integrated market, I think, for energy makes a lot of sense. The last bit is to move towards essentially a standardized forward contract or futures market, where you would create essentially a product, a standardized product that, say, in the case of an LMP market, it clears against the quantity weighted average LMP in the day ahead market, for example. And then what you could have is essentially mandates for all retailers to purchase the standardized contract at various horizons to delivery. And what you can do as the market operator is change the percentages of demand at the various horizons as you become concerned about reliability. And essentially the advantage here is that you don't have to have a capacity requirement. You simply let the market figure out how much capacity is needed to serve demand. And the other is that with the integrated market, futures market, standardized futures market, you're increasing liquidity. You're essentially providing retailers with essentially this hedge, so they are protected against short-term price volatility, but effectively you're essentially now allowing it, as I said, to clear against the day-ahead market, which is going to provide very strong incentives for the retail, the suppliers that sell these forward contracts to actually fulfill the contract rather than delay. If they've sold the contract and the expiration date comes, they are on the hook to buy out of the short-term market to essentially replace what they didn't supply from their forward contract. So, so the example with this high level of fixed price forward contract coverage, you'll get aggressive bidding in the bid-based market. You will have potentially high short-term prices, but it will just be the high short-term prices borne by the generators that are short, paid to the generators that are long, because retailers are covered through these fixed price forward contracts sold through these standardized forward market. Okay, so basically, I think, as we said, multi-settlement bid-based market is the standard. I think it has realized significant benefits, as I've shown you from the example of California. I think it is feasible to implement in Brazil. I think that there are significant benefits that are likely to result. I think a bid-based market is certainly possible with the high level of forward contracting that's available. And if you are going to stay with a cost-based market, increase the cost of shortage, reduce the capacity payment. It has reliability benefits. It rewards the thermal units. It certainly seems to me rewards demand response. The last is if retail competition, interval meters, symmetric treatment, meaning the default price that the retailer has to pay to serve a customer is their actual consumption times the wholesale price. And then as we said, the idea of the standardized forward market with an integration of energy, new energy and old energy certainly seems long-term lower cost, even though it may be shorter-term lower cost in terms of procurement. Thank you.
Nós agradecemos o Frank Wolak pela sua apresentação. Neste momento, o Richard já está caminhando aqui para o palco, porque ele fará uma rápida moderação aí de perguntas e respostas. Talvez, devido ao horário, umas 2 ou 3 questões. Já tem algumas aqui em suas mãos. As recepcionistas, por favor, se alguém tiver mais alguma questão, levante, por favor, que elas retirem com vocês.
Perdão. A primeira pergunta é, supondo que o Brasil reconheça a necessidade de mudar para um sistema do mercado cost-based, né, baseado no custo, para um sistema bid-based, né, baseado no lance de preço, como essa mudança deve ser implementada? Quais são os principais passos? Por onde devemos começar? E qual é os horizontes de tempo para realizar isso?
Yes. Okay, sorry. So I think, certainly you would not just, you want advanced planning, but I don't think would be particularly difficult. I think it could be something that could be accomplished in, say, a 1 to 2 year time horizon. The big thing that I would recommend is simply running, if you like, a parallel market. So what you can do, and one of the things that certainly is possible, is first just simply, if you're going to go to, say, an LMP market, you could first run the LMP market as cost-based, and then what you could do is, over time, have a sort of go-live date once everyone's familiar with how to submit their bids. People have been running in the parallel bid-based market, so the idea would be is you're running the LMP market as cost-based, you're getting LMPs, then you're having people submit bids, and then you're running the LMP market with those system conditions. You're showing people the LMPs that come out, and then eventually what happens is that you just transition from the cost-based dispatch to the bid-based dispatch, and say 2 years from the date that you've initiated this process. So, I mean, I think would be fairly straightforward to do, but as I said, the two things I would do is, it's transition. So first, maybe cost-based LMP, multi-settlement, then with parallel market, and then bid-based once everybody's at least comfortable and have their systems in place to actually participate.
A segunda pergunta é do Bruno, da EDP. Quanto de capacidade ociosa é precisa para que preços de curto prazo não disparem em mercados hidro, eólicos e térmicos?
I guess my answer to that question would be is that personally, as a consumer, I want as little generation capacity on the system as possible because I know that I will have to pay for that. But what I want is, I want essentially the lowest price possible, and I want a reliable supply of energy. And that's where I think the importance of credible forward contracts really comes in, and that's where the multi-settlement market, I think, really has its bite, in that what it says is that you, a supplier, if you sold in the forward market, that is a firm financial commitment, that's a schedule, and if you fail to meet that schedule in terms of a generation unit, then you must purchase out of the real-time market at whatever price is necessary to effectively meet your shortfall, and that could be a very high price. But could go to the next step is, I'd argue that's a good thing. But the next, because it punishes the guy that fails to fulfill his contract, then the other side of it is that consumers will be protected from that very high price by the fact that they have the forward contract for energy that essentially means that their price of energy is what they have in their forward contract. But they also have the option, if they can reduce their demand, to essentially sell what they had purchased in the forward market at that very high price, and therefore reduce the average price that they pay for electricity. So another advantage of the multi-settlement system. And so I guess what I would to say in response to the question is, high prices are a good thing. Because of the fact that they encourage demand reduction, they encourage generators to be on and supplying, and they punish those that aren't. But the important thing is we just have to make sure that consumers are adequately protected by the fact that they have essentially a forward contract that fixes the price for the vast majority of their consumption.
A terceira pergunta do Luiz Barroso, da PSR. Os direitos financeiros de transmissão seriam uma pré-condição para o mercado com LMP, Local Marginal Pricing. No Brasil, a renda de congestão já possui usos pré-definidos, por exemplo, o MRE, o Mecanismo de Relocação de Energia. Isso não dificultaria a implementação de LMP no Brasil?
Bad boy. Luis. I know Luis. So, no. So but seriously, believe it or not, there are LMP markets without financial transmission rights. So to go a bit into the weeds, the way it works in an LMP market is the total amount of revenues that I collect from loads is typically greater than the total amount of revenues that I pay to generators. And the easiest way to see that is that think of it as generators are typically going to be located in areas where there's plenty of generation. So average prices there are likely to be lower than the areas where there are essentially load is more than generation. And so think of in a lossless network, you can immediately see that that's going to mean that the average price that load pays is higher than the average price that generators receive. This creates what we would call a merchandising surplus. And so somehow what we have to do is come up with a way to redistribute this so-called merchandising surplus to loads. In some markets, this is done through essentially just pro rata refunds. So in other words, what I do is I say, you are 10% of the load, you will get 10% of this merchandising surplus. In other markets, the way it's done is through what are called financial transmission rights, where what we do is we redistribute it through the fact that you've got a hedge against the price difference at, say, node A versus node B. I guess my view is that that's a secondary issue as to how you would like to redistribute the congestion revenue rights or merchandising surplus, to customers. The biggest thing, though, is the advantage of LMP is the fact that you are pricing all these relevant transmission constraints. My view would be is if a market for financial transmission rights would like to evolve, it will evolve. Buyers and sellers will provide insurance against locational price risks to each other. I may sell to someone else. They may buy it from me because we have a disagreement on the level of price differences between these two locations. But one simple solution to start with would be just simply to say, look, we're going to refund that merchandising surplus to loads in proportion to their total withdrawals from the grid. If a secondary market for financial transmission rights develops, fine, we're okay with it. People can sign those deals. But I guess I would say that I don't think that's necessarily going to be an impediment to the start of a locational marginal pricing market.
Tá, finalmente, para terminar, uma rápida pergunta. O senhor falou de Local Market Power Mitigation Mechanisms. Você explicar o que é isso, como isso funciona?
Sure. Okay, I just wanted to say all the questions were excellent. So obviously you guys know about the electricity industry. That's a joke. So the way that a local market power mitigation mechanism works is that typically what happens is that the configuration of so let's take an example from California. In California, there is a generation unit located in the city of San Francisco. There is finite transmission into the city of San Francisco. There are times when demand in San Francisco gets sufficiently high that generator that's located in San Francisco knows no matter what I bid, they got to take me. My bid price could be infinity, and they would have to take my bid, or else they would have to shut the lights off. So that is an example of local market, we'd say local market power. It's essentially market power in a small region because of the fact of the transmission network having finite capacity. And so all U.S. markets, and I can't emphasize this enough, all U.S. LMP markets have essentially local market power mitigation mechanisms that say, okay, if a set of circumstances arises in the grid such that one or two generators
know that they're needed to meet demand because of the fact that demand is, in their region is so high, then their bids will be mitigated to some level. And typically it's, maybe marginal cost plus a bid adder or something. But basically that's what a local market power mitigation mechanism. So think of it as the forward contracting requirement, that covers the so-called system-wide market power challenges that you might think. Then the existence of this local market power mitigation mechanism that essentially checks to see whether or not you have this ability to raise prices substantially in your local area. It then checks, and if you do, it would then mitigate your bid in the LMP dispatch process. And in all the markets, this process is completely automatic. So in other words, I submit my bids, they run this check. If I pass this check, then my bid goes through. If I don't, then my mitigated bid goes into the LMP pricing process, and I still get paid the market clearing price at my location. So I'm still going to get that scarcity premium if I'm scarce at that location. I'm just not going to be able to bid higher than what I would bid under competitive conditions, i.e. my marginal cost.
Muito obrigado. Esse foi o professor Dr. Frank Wolak. Obrigado, Richard, que moderou aqui também as questões. Nós faremos um breve intervalo, um coffee break de 20 minutos. Acho que não dá nem isso. 10h40, retornaremos pontualmente. Muito obrigado a todos.